Welcome, everybody. The Front Porch is our series here at First Unitarian Church of Dallas, where we have important conversations about the world we live in, and today is no exception. We have Jenn Holland here today. Jen is can I call you Jen?
Please.
Jen is a professor of history at the University of Oklahoma, specializing in herstories, we should say, of gender and sexuality, the American West, and the 20th century U.S. politics. She is the author of Tiny U, A Western History of the Anti-Abortion Movement. She has degrees from the University of Michigan, Utah State University, and the University of Wisconsin, which we share. Although I didn't get a degree there. And she was a pro-choice activist in college before she became a historical specialist on abortion. Recently, her research was featured in outlets such as the New York Times, the Sunday Times of London, The Nation, Washington Post, The Guardian, The Progressives, and I heard her on NPR about 2 or 3 weeks ago talking. So we are so glad to have Jenn Holland. Will you welcome Jen?
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, welcome. And it isn't often that we get to say that Oklahoma politics looks worse than Texas. But I read an article about the 5 different contradictory abortion laws passed there. What is going on in your state with regards to abortion right now?
I think that it is a mystery in a certain sense because they already have a trigger law. So if Roe falls, as we all think it will, Oklahoma would ban abortion. And yet they passed numerous bills, competing bills, and I think, one in the House and one in the Senate. And I think that's partly because so many legislators in that state want to claim authorship over these kinds of bills for running. That the governor, Kevin Stitt, keeps saying he wants Oklahoma to be the most pro-life state. And I think this is also about competing with Texas, because if anyone's been to Oklahoma, I don't know if Texans feel it, but Oklahomans feel it.
Is there a competition between Texas and Oklahoma?
I mean, it's hard for me to gauge whether Texans feel this as intensely.
How many OU people are here?
Oh, yeah.
How many UT people are here? Oh,
yeah.
boy.
Okay,
yeah,
so
there we
football
go.
rivalries.
You wore your colors, though, so.
Oh, yeah, I did not intend that. But so I think that there's this desire to claim the first, this desire to be the most. And it's a competition with Texas, but it's also about winning elections. And I think those kinds of claims are going to become harder. They are going to be more complicated after Roe falls, that people are going to start seeing the practical effects of illegal abortion. And so I think that they're trying to get this out now and claim it before it gets too messy. So that's what I would say, because there's not really any need for it. When Roe's over, they're going to ban it, but ban it until what? A month from now, when the trigger law would go into effect.
Yeah, it seems like a little overboard.
Yeah, because it's not practical. It's about getting votes. It's about being able to put something on your political advertisement.
Isn't it all about that? These are ideologically driven. Driven arguments. If that calls for me, let me know. These are ideologically driven arguments. What do politicians gain from this except more support from emboldened people? Tell me.
Well, so I think on the one hand, in the last 20 years, a different breed of Republican, I think, has largely been elected, and that is you have more people who are ideologues on this issue, that is not all cynical. But I also think that for the party as a whole, and this has been true since the mid-'70s, is that this is an easy politics because Roe stood, right? So you could pass laws till the cows came home, and they'd be relatively cheap, except for sort of moving things up the ladder of, up to the courts. You could pass things and Roe would protect it from going into effect. And so this was a cheap way to get votes for the most part. You could just say the right things, maybe pass a law that would never go into effect, and that would secure you, not a majority of voters, but a deeply committed minority who would come to the polls and vote for you no matter what. And that made it a very easy political calculation.
Let's go back in history a little bit, because you're a historian. You've got way more experience in that than I do. What I understand is Southern Baptist Convention, Criswell down at First Baptist. These were pro-choice evangelical Baptists when Roe was passed. We get to Bob Jones University and the segregation case. It goes through the Supreme Court. William Rehnquist is the only dissenting vote. They don't get to continue segregation into the 70s, and evangelicals come out of that case saying, how do we gain political power? And they decide on abortion. Is there truth in that? Did it start before that? Was that a key moment? Was that just one in many moments? Enlighten us on all that.
Yeah, I think that on the one hand, I think segregationists did easily blend into social conservatives. Like that happened. And also, I don't think there's a historian who's been sort of selling this as like a cynical, like we can't gain power this way, we've got to get power that way. And I think that that's not quite right, though I think race plays a central role, but just not in that kind of way.
Okay.
So I think that what happens with Baptists, of course, is a Catholic-led movement, right, throughout the 70s, and Baptists gradually get on board, and you have anti-abortion activists within evangelical churches pushing. But also evangelicals are these denominations are changing in the 70s. They are becoming more fundamentalist in a whole host of ways. And so by the late 70s, these activists, and perhaps the decline of other politics, created this space for social conservatism to come in and really take root in a way that it didn't in the early to mid 70s in a profound way. But I do think that race matters less in an overt, like, oh, we can't win segregation, so we win this way, is that I think that white conservatives were like wrestling with how to be moral, right? How to claim morality and also maintain racial hierarchy after the civil rights movement. And the anti-abortion movement provided this incredibly powerful venue for that. To be like, we are moral, and look, there are victims, and they're mostly white. And actually there's a genocide going on, and we can claim the inheritance of the civil rights movement, right? They claim that over and over again. We are an extension of Martin Luther King's civil rights movement, but we're defending these innocents, right? And who are mostly white, but will trot out, sort of black people now and again to show this. So they're able to claim morality for conservative white people when the civil rights movement had destabilized that and asked white people to undermine racial hierarchies. And they were like, how do we not do that and also claim morality for ourselves again? And I think the movement really provided this way for Catholics, evangelicals, other religious people in the South, in the West, in the North, all to do that.
And there was also people like Phyllis Schlafly and this whole movement around what mothering and parenting and roles of women. Can you unpack some of that?
Yeah, so this is a part of a rising anti-feminist movement. And I think that Schlafly is a part of that story. I mean, I think that there's a story built out of social conservative movements, anti-ERA movements and anti-abortion movements, but these were natural, they were immediate. These moments happened, and all of a sudden there was a uprising, right, of concerned people. But that's not really what these movements were. They were a decade's worth of work, or more in terms of the anti-abortion movement, to convince people that feminism was undermining something core about human life, changing gender roles in perverse ways, right? These are grassroots mobilizations that take time. And so Schlafly's crusade is an absolute backdrop to what's happening with the anti-abortion movement, because they are also slowly suggesting that, oh, feminism looks good on the cover. But really, what they're doing is sinisterly sort of undermining the relationship between men and women and reproduction. Oh, and maybe you're going to have to go to war if the ERA passed. Maybe women will get drafted. Or bathrooms, God forbid, will be gender neutral. These are the kinds of things that I said, it might look good on the surface, but it's not. And so I think this is a decade's worth of work that the anti-abortion movement also sort of taps into and generates concern that feminism is undermining society.
We had some people worrying about our gender-neutral bathrooms, but I think that was a different issue.
It comes up over, well, you can see it in a lot of the anti-trans work. It sort of keeps cropping up, right? This concern over bathrooms, and that really...
it's fear and insecurity at some level, right?
Right.
What are the kinds of things we could learn from the strategies of those anti-abortion movements? So what were the strategies? What can we learn?
Yeah.
Because you've got 4 decades now, right? Am I right? So
almost 5.
Almost 5 decades of anti-abortion movement. We're at the precipice of them winning.
Yeah.
On so many huge victories. What can we learn?
So one of the things that I write about a lot is that I think the success of this movement was built on a very personal and intimate politics. That they came into congregations, they came into schools, and they waged a war for hearts and minds. And that the legislative battles and the politicians, they did essential work, but it was this everyday activism that came into especially churches and really motivated a certain group of Christians to make this their defining issue. And I think the things that you're doing now in this church are incredibly powerful because they are working to counter that, right? Because I think that one of the problems is the silence and shame that sort of ran up against putting pro-choice reproductive justice into religious and intimate spaces and into media spaces, right? All those essential spaces became more and more silent for that side of the issue over the last 50 years, even as the anti-abortion movement demanded presence in these spaces, and media too. They came with a cost if you talked about legal abortion, because they made sure it came with a cost. And so I think that that's the thing. I would not suggest, there's a whole host of things that they do I would not suggest that the other side do, because I think they're unethical. But that, I think, is something to do, right? As you heard, right, 1 in 3 women get abortions over the course of their lives, and that's a truth. And that's a truth that is in everyday life, but is not spoken about nearly as much as it could be, and should be, and needs to be. So I think that doing that work, speaking about it, and facing the future with open eyes and not turning away from the suffering that we are going to see. That is true, and it's easy to get burned out. But we need to train our eyes to it and keep speaking about it, and not let it sort of just get washed out with the news cycle.
Absolutely. I've felt a little burned out lately.
I hear you.
I'm sure you've been answering lots of media calls like I have.
Yes.
Yeah, and maybe many more. Let's get into the clinic. So I spent the last 6-7 years sitting in the clinic as a volunteer chaplain, mostly because I wanted the patients to know that not all people of faith were like the people outside.
Yeah.
And I got there because of this person in the front row who invited me in, and she was working there. And what I heard stories from the patients over and over were that they had gone to these clinics that were parked across the street or catty corner across the street, and went in there, had sonograms, had then counseling conversations in which they were essentially traumatized and terrified.
Yeah.
And when they got to our clinic, if they did, they would burst into tears telling me about those experiences. You spent time in these clinics. Tell us how that happened, what that was about. Go for it. Tell us all about it. Because I said this to a few people, and they said, "What? There are fake clinics?" No, like.
Oh yeah.
Like these are the crisis pregnancy centers. These are some other places. Take some time here and really lay this out, because this is a tactic that seems unethical and
right. Yeah. So crisis pregnancy centers, they were created very early. I mean, the late 60s is when they begin, first in Canada, and then they very quickly spread here. The first one that is modeled is Birthright. They're still around. And what they always were made to deceive. That's really what they were. And partly you wouldn't maybe know that you've seen them because they are not clear about, especially their advertising. The classic ones are you pregnant, scared? Come see us, right? And they always were trying to get anyone they could to come in. And the hook beyond that was a free pregnancy test. So they knew they were gonna be serving poor women. They immediately were set up in urban areas, often women of color and young women, right? All these people who likely didn't have access to independent healthcare. But you could get anybody, right? Because of the deceptive advertising. And they would, put these advertisements all around where they thought these populations might be. And then they draw them in and they say, come here, come to this site. And then they would, sort of play the part of a medical provider, where they take their urine and do the pregnancy test in the early days. And they would then, especially at first, they give you sort of fetal models and just give you the anti-abortion pitch. And they would never obviously counsel to go over to abortion, but they're all about sort of taking people away and trying to convince them not to seek an abortion. And it ratchets up as time goes on, right? Because the movement develops more and more material itself. So you get more and more graphic films, right, that are going in. They always had a donations closet. So they're really trying to get women who, need stuff, right, to come in. And in the 80s, they eventually these clinics, I don't want to say clinics, these crisis pregnancy centers, they realized that people are coming for the donations closet, and there's a certain population who sort of figured them out. And they're so upset that these people are not actually considering abortion. They're taking advantage of them, right? When the whole setup is based on deceiving the people who they're drawing in. They're so upset about that. And so then they create these ways that you have to earn the donated stuff. And so they create all these classes that basically, some of them are about parenting, but a lot of them are about sort of, you have to take a class in conservative gender and sexual ideology, pass, and then you get your dollars to use in the boutique, right? And so this is this kind of ideological transformation, and especially as the movement in the 80s develops this idea that women are traumatized by abortion. Like, women were always sort of the thorn in the side of the anti-abortion movement because they kept saying abortion's murder. But the person seeking an abortion then was a murderer. Like, that is the only logical conclusion, but they knew that was not quite popular, right? So they're trying to hide that part of the story. They focus on abortion providers a lot, but they were how do we talk about the abortion seeker? In the 80s, they're oh, we figured it out. We'll talk about her as also traumatized by abortion, as a second victim. And they developed all of these trainings and what they call post-abortion counseling, trying to convince someone who might be seriously upset or might just be sort of uncomfortable. And they bring them in and then try to convince them that everything in their lives that's wrong stemmed from their abortion. And then they get them to both work in crisis pregnancy centers and then also testify to state legislators. And so all of these laws, so many of these laws from the 80s onward, you have these women who are testifying, but also the bills themselves are in the name of women, right? Women's right to know bills or protecting women. This becomes this major narrative. And this is really incubated in many ways at the crisis pregnancy centers. And they remain, and they become more medical, which draws in even more people. They eventually get ultrasounds, so people who, these are sort of, or STI, STD tests, right? They get money from not only conservative juggernauts, but also increasingly states. The state of Oklahoma sends a host of money to these centers to convince people seeking abortion not to have them. And so these are increasingly funded in real ways, especially in the 90s and thousands.
They are actually right now funded by Texas tax dollars in incredible levels.
Right.
And they're going to get more.
Oh yeah, and
What are they going to do?
money,
What are they
too.
going to do after abortion's illegal?
That's a good question. I'm sure they have ideas about what they're going to do. I mean, I think that I don't know. Some anti-abortion activists imagine that they are going to have to do more social service-like things, but as a historian, I will say there is no precedent for that, besides these like very manipulative donations closets. So were I to guess, which I don't do too much as a historian, I would say that's not going to happen. But that's sort of what they imagine. And I think they're going to increasingly, as people getting legal information is going to become illegal, you can imagine how these deceptive practices might not only rope in people who they might be traumatized, but then they could rope them in and get them enmeshed in the legal system, right?
Right. Tell us a story about how you got involved in this and how you got inside those clinics. How did all that happen? I wouldn't expect that was an easy...
undercover. I'm a historian, not a journalist. So I was a pro-choice activist in college. I don't really remember how I got into it, but I became very committed to it. And in graduate school, I loved history. And people said, well, write about something you care about, because you have to do this for a decade. I've been doing this for way more than a decade. It takes forever. But so this was a thing that I wanted to understand, and so I was determined to write a history about it. So I moved slightly away from activist towards scholar, and I needed to do oral histories with a whole host of anti-abortion activists, and so I just wrote them or called them and asked if I could come as a historian and interview them about their past. And I'll say it was the hardest part of the job I did, and that's because the ethics of a historian, you have to be honest, right, about what you're doing. And so I said, no one's written about this. I'm interested. Can I talk to you and figure out what the history is? But they very quickly assumed that if I was interested, and I think if I looked like this, that they sort of assumed I looked like a nice girl, and they just had such a polar eyes, which had to do with gender and race and all these things. And they fit me into, then if you are a quote unquote nice girl, you can't possibly support abortion rights, right? And so they kept reading me as an activist, and I kept having to be like, no, don't read me that way. That's not my politics. I'm a scholar also. But I kept having to refine my intro to try keep being as honest as I could about who I was. But also, as a historian, I couldn't do what good historians do. So I had people be like, come spend the summer with me, read through I have a basement full of documents, or come to this conference with me, come home, my wife will cook you dinner. And I just couldn't do any of those things. I didn't feel emotionally like I could. I didn't want to deceive them, because that was not within that's not what I wanted to do. But I also couldn't be with them for any length of time. So it was a hard thing, and I don't know whether like feminist oral histories, they suggest you involve yourself in relationships with your subjects. Like you develop honest, open relationships. And I needed the honesty, but I couldn't have the relationship.
Because it was difficult for you to
Yeah.
hear what they were saying? And what were the kinds of things they were telling you that were...
I think, I think that they wanted to be friends. They were open,
Yeah.
and I appreciated, I wanted to understand what they did, and I didn't think they were the devil incarnate or anything, but I also abhorred what they were doing. And I didn't want to get involved. I had people say, oh, I could look in the eyes of a woman and know whether she had an abortion. And I had an abortion not that long ago. And I was like, this is very odd. Is he telling me that he's looking in my eyes and reading me? But I don't think he was, I think he was saying he could read me. And but he wasn't. But it was this desperately uncomfortable interaction as a result. So I don't know if that's a full answer, but
Yeah.
I've committed myself to so much of my life in one way or another to this, and I do have a point of view, but I also wanted to look sort of clear-eyed at the other side to help, like to figure out how we got, even before this moment, right? Abortion has been inaccessible for huge swaths of the population. And I wanted to understand how we got there after the late 60s and 70s, right? How did we? So I wanted to understand it, but I wasn't ready to sort of befriend.
Sure. The
activists.
people who developed these fake clinics, were they aware of what they were doing? Yes. Deception? And then, I mean, but how did they square this with their faith? Walk us through some kind of rationale in their ideological position, in their behavior and their theology or something, as much as you can understand that.
Well,
if you can.
I talked to people who were really at the very early stages of these crises, like they created them in their communities, and they were very straightforward with me. They were like, we get this number of calls, and I had one activist tell me every single person who called was looking for an abortion. Like they absolutely knew, and it's built into all the instructions about how to create these. Is like you have to be vague, and you have to say these things this way in order to bring in. That is the only ethos of it, is to get people looking for abortions, but they mistakenly come here. And the theology, early on, they were mostly Catholic, so evangelicals, when they join, they participate and then they start their own often. And they never spoke to me about an ethics around the deception. They never were concerned about it. The ultimate goal, of course, was stopping abortions. And that was they thought they were saving lives, and they were committed to those things. And they thought that this was, especially the way the movement very quickly talked about this as a rights abuse, but also a genocide. And so it's not just that this was a theological commitment, it just amped up the intensity of this, right? That you're not just sort of stopping someone from getting an abortion, you're incrementally stopping a genocide, and that seemed to be a greater good for them. I mean, not even a greater good. I don't think I ever heard anyone worried in the least about deceiving people. And the deceptions are profound, and this they did not cop to, though it's documented that it occurs, is at a lot of crisis pregnancy centers still to this day, especially with ultrasounds. They tell people where they are in their pregnancies, and they regularly would tell people they were earlier in their pregnancies, hoping that they would be like, oh, I have a little more time to think about this. And then they would wait. But then in fact, they were further along, and they were hoping that they would wait long enough that their state then would have banned it at that point. So, the deception, and then also a whole host of other things, right? They were for a long time selling people that like abortion caused breast cancer, all of these sort of totally wrong things, right? But in the crisis, it's sort of a microcosm, right? They were talking to individuals, but then you can see in the broader society, they're actually selling broader publics and also getting into policy these lies, right? Women's right to know bills were made the state demanded that women hear anti-abortion misinformation, right? On their way to an abortion, the state mandated that. So the theology, I think that Catholics obviously were committed early on, though not consistently, that abortion and birth control were interruptions of God's natural plan. And evangelicals, interestingly, right, in the 60s and 70s, they keep saying, we believe in a literal interpretation of the Bible, and the Bible's not clear, right? You have so many people say that over and over and over again, but by the late 70s and 80s, you have all of these socially conservative evangelical writers who were like, actually, no, the Bible's super clear about abortion. And they put it into every publication, and so much that it becomes a defining principle of what it means to be evangelical as opposed to everybody else. And also, I think the sleight of the hand is also, they say it's a defining principle of what it means to be a Christian. or even a monotheist. They use these Judeo-Christian values, right? That's their phrase for a long time. Judeo-Christian values, all monotheists believe that abortion's murder, as different from Romans and Greeks especially. And so there's a sleight of hand that erases the past of religious people who had a very different theological commitment to issues surrounding reproduction and abortion. And it allowed them to sort of grab a hold of the moral authority of religion writ large as a moment where that is more and more acceptable to enter American politics in the 80s and 90s and thousands.
Mm. One of the most interesting pieces of mail I got in the last 6 months
Yikes.
was a DVD of a film equating Nazi Germany and the extinction of the Jews with abortion.
Yeah.
It made it into my garbage can pretty quickly. I didn't really explore it very much. But this notion of genocide, so how do they pick this up? How do they get to this? Because that's a pretty big jump.
Yeah. So if we think about where this movement, the moment in which it's sort of coming into being, that sort of helps us understand why they use the arguments they use. Is they're coming of age in sort of the early 70s. They started in the mid to late 60s, but really coming of age and sort of solidifying their arguments. This is a moment when the civil rights movement is being sort of whitewashed and sanitized in a particular way, right? That like civil rights activists were like the right way to protest around race as opposed to the black activists of the 70s. And also it's the moment when the Holocaust is becoming ever present in American culture. It wasn't immediate right after World War II. I mean, there was a really slow progression of knowledge around the Holocaust. And so it had sort of seeped in a more profound way, and it become this essential touchstone for Americans wrestling with ethics. And so the anti-abortion movement's being born at this moment, and they grab a hold of these essential sort of moral touchstones at that moment. And it becomes, and I'll say this is like, especially when you go back in the past, they're working it out. You can see that they're working it out because for a long time, they really focused on Japan and Sweden because those were the places where you could get abortions relatively easily. That's where people flew before abortion was legal here. But they kept saying, oh, this is a slippery slope. It's gonna end in genocide. But you kept looking at Japan and Sweden and it didn't happen, right? And so they eventually like sort of sidelined Japan and Sweden, and they focus more on Germany, on Nazi Germany and the Holocaust. And there was enforced abortion of certain people in Nazi Germany, though certainly not all. And this is part of the broader campaign to eliminate what they considered the unwanted. But it had begun, legal abortion in Germany had begun actually with socialist feminists early in the 20th century, really arguing. And so it wasn't born, right, from Nazism. It was born from an ethos about a commitment to women's reproductive autonomy. But it's so useful to this movement. And the civil rights, the ways that they use both Jim Crow and slavery and the civil rights movement and the Holocaust, they use them in similar ways, right? They use them they co-opt them, their moral power, and they use them to sort of create the fetus as a human victim akin, but also they say this is a worse thing. It's not just like the Holocaust, it is worse because, and they say for two reasons. One is that fetuses are innocent in the way that no one who's born could possibly be. Right, so they're like, oh, and you have people writing in saying like, Jews at least could, and you're like, no, whatever that sentence ends is wrong. But basically they're like, Jews could do something, right, to get away, unlike fetuses. And then, so they do that, right, that enslaved people and Jews could do something. And so they have personal responsibility, right? But also, after legal abortion, they count. And so they enumerate, and they enumerate abortions. So they gradually are like, oh, well, this many people died in the Civil War, this many people died in the Holocaust, and we can see that this genocide is worse. And so it's never just, it is co-option and also it's hierarchy, right? That this is not just akin to those things, it's worse than those things. And that motivates not ever a majority, but this incredibly powerful minority to be compelled that this is the only issue that matters, right? No other issue could possibly matter as much as this issue.
So Holocaust deniers probably have a little trouble getting into this. How did that? It's that's a weird thing. I mean,
it's like there are overtly white supremacists and Holocaust deniers, but there isn't as much awkwardness actually as you might expect from a movement that co-ops those things. Like they sort of sit alongside each other and just sort of don't acknowledge the.
They compartmentalize.
They compartmentalize, and if something comes up, they're like, oh, the mainstream movement's able to be like, oh, no, they aren't one of us. But really, it's totally fine, mostly.
Right.
They don't really deal with, especially I think after Trump was elected, I was interested because the dog whistles, of course, went away. And when people speak things openly, they're like, well, how does a movement that's spoken in the language of the civil rights movement and racial justice reckon with this? Turns out there wasn't much problem with it. They didn't reckon. They just were like, okay, yeah, that too. And so you had this constituency of young people who I think now still, I mean, they like to think of themselves as abolitionists. That's what they call themselves. And they sit relatively easily alongside really overtly racist, Republican, and in the same conference and same spaces, and they don't seem to have much conflict with one another. And I think that highlights very clearly that this was always co-option, right? That is always a very superficial borrowing of these histories, right? And not really any real commitment to anti-Semitism, racial justice. They were just like, if you solve abortion, all these other things will be solved too.
Yeah, we had the abolitionists out in front of the church at one point. They were protesting my involvement in Planned Parenthood, and that's what they called themselves.
Yeah.
Which begs the question of digging even deeper into slavery, forced pregnancy, experimentation on women's bodies.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about how this history even goes into that time.
Yeah,
200 years now. We're not even last 50 years now. We're
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that women of color, but especially Black women, have been have borne the brunt of every bad reproductive trend. That the eugenics movement during slavery. So many of the innovations of the early OB-GYNs, right? They were creating these specialties where they needed to be able to practice. And so they went to the South before the end of slavery, and they made agreements with slave owners, and they practiced on enslaved women. And that's how they developed, and there's no pain medication. This was early surgery. It was torture, and it was, and so this was an excruciating past that Americans writ large need to reckon with. And that is true for not just the anti-abortion movement, that is true for everybody. That Margaret Sanger famously, she did have eugenics arguments, especially in the 20s and 30s. And the country was involved in eugenics arguments. So this is a broad reckoning that I think Americans need to deal with. And the anti-abortion movement is a part of that story because they think that they argue that the worst thing to happen to Black women ever is abortion. That's the argument. And that's the ways that they use Black women as props to say that. And they talk about Margaret Sanger's eugenics only, right, to do that work. Not to actually reckon with this American past, which we all need to, but really to just simply use them as props to convince people that the reproductive justice movement, which has been led in many ways by Black women, is in fact a fundamentally racist movement.
Can you unpack the eugenics in just a couple sentences?
Yes,
eugenics. And then we're going to turn to the audience. And
what it is.
There's a mic here, and we're going to ask you to come forward if you're comfortable to ask a question to that mic so we can hear it for the recording. But Eugenics 101, go.
Okay, so Margaret Sanger began not as a eugenicist. She was developed these ideas that women needed to put the information in their hands, right? She was distributing pamphlets about how to, stop reproduction on your own. But by the 20s, she has really shifted and is making eugenics arguments alongside the arguments about women's own autonomy. And she's making them full-throatedly, right? And she's getting a lot of money for her cause for that reason. And the 20s and 30s is a moment of where eugenics was this scientifically rooted idea, but it was very common in among biologists, right? The idea that basically humans, their reproduction should be, they should encourage the reproduction of the fit and discourage the reproduction of the unfit, and that would eventually make the human species better. So there was akin to breeding animals that you could do the same with humans. And so eugenics had two sides, encouraging the fit. So for example, Harvard, until the late 60s, measured the bodies of every incoming student in order to get a sense of what the perfect, right, the fit body looked like. And the other side, the negative eugenics, was to try to discourage the reproduction. And that ranged in a whole host of ways, but also, of course, forced sterilization, which in the 20s was law in many states. And Buck versus Bell, the Supreme Court decision that said it was constitutional, still stands technically. And then in the 60s, is not done by law, but continues to be practiced on forced sterilization on women of color almost exclusively. That doctors just, they forcibly sterilize huge swaths of, Black women, Native women, and Mexican-American women are forcibly sterilized. I think one in four Native women were sterilized in the 60s and 70s. And that's a long outcome of this eugenics thinking, that some people shouldn't reproduce.
And then it's, again, used in Nazi Germany as an argument.
So the Nazis take from one of these early American eugenicists. They take one of these early pamphlets and just and take it over and expand it.
And it was so popular that there is a lot of evidence that there were Unitarians who were in power who were promoting this as well. I mean, not only, these are progressive religious people, but this is so common a conversation.
It's so common.
That it's not conservative, it's mainstream.
Yeah, it's in every textbook.
Yeah.
It's in, Margaret Sanger she might have been personally committed to it, but also she was applying to these huge funding entities who that was what they were interested in. They weren't interested in birth control on its own, they were interested in eugenics. And so they were willing to send her money. And so you can imagine this was better baby, everyone fairs around America would measure your baby and tell you who was perfect. And eugenics was just in the water in American life in this really profound way up until World War II.
Right.
And then because of Nazi Germany, doesn't look, even though it continues, but it's just not as openly promoted as it was between the 20s and the 40s. It's just everywhere.
Yeah. Okay, I could ask you lots of questions on and on, but I want to hear from the folks here. If you have a question, please come to this microphone and not make statements, but ask questions would be helpful. Get me off the hot seat. And the first question is always the hardest to get, so come forward. Yeah, come forward. Yeah.
This isn't necessarily so much about history, but as you talk about the history of what's happened and all this negative truth or counter truths and stuff that came up, for instance, how abortions are going to cause mental health issues and breast cancer and all these craziness. How do we be proactive in when we are post-Roe to get the real truth out? How do you have anything on that to get the real truth out? Because we're still going to fight these counter truths.
Yeah, that's such a good question. And it's going to be harder because people have been working. I mean, I think that some people, journalists I've talked to are like, oh, this must be the fault of the reproductive justice movement. They let this happen. It's just like, these people have been working in states like Texas and Oklahoma in very hard circumstances to get truth out and access, and been doing it in the face of this for so long. And that's when saying correct things was legal, right? And even if there were these state mandated counter things, but what happens when it's illegal? And when the state can track your seeking for that knowledge. I mean, I think that the internet is probably the people's best option, but then the tracking becomes more important. Sometimes I think, well, people are gonna have to like meet places without their phones and like, so no one can track you, right? And speak face to face in this weird way, because that's the way you circumvent the surveillance of the state, or potentially, because even if your phone's off, the state can figure out where you are, or if the state wants to access your phone information. So I think being innovative, I think that going back to ways that sort of figuring out how to use the internet, but also thinking about how to get out of electronic communication, or being mindful of that. I mean, we'll see what the state's interested in doing. But some individuals can just buy your information too. So it doesn't even need to be the state, especially if you have bounty hunters.
Big Brother's real, you say?
We are coming on that moment. I don't know if the state of Oklahoma is going to want to put their money, because that's the thing they're always, or Texas. Texas has more money. Oklahoma doesn't want to spend money on anything, but they will need to if they want to sincerely stop people from accessing abortion.
I actually, just to go on, Tom, I actually had many years ago a big conversation with a protester out in front of a Planned Parenthood event, and she was telling me how many people got cancer and the whole thing, and I just go, I don't know. Like, I don't know what to say to this. Seems strange, it seems crazy, but yeah. Tom.
Yeah, my question is, so right now we're in a situation where a small but very vocal and energetic minority is basically imposing a narrative that's counter to what the majority of people in this country want.
Right.
I mean, and is there historic precedent for that, and more importantly, historic precedent for turning that around and reclaiming our democracy, essentially, in the context of this issue?
Well, I think actually that is, American history is rife with, famously, right?
Falsehoods?
Falsehoods, and also the denial of democracy. I mean, that there are huge swaths of the American population who, right, even if we're just talking about voting, who are denied access to the ballot boxes, this essential piece. But the thing that I find hopeful is that in the last 50 years, while we are coming to this moment of turning back 50 years of rights, we also have movements who've been working for 50 years to make the United States democratic in a way that it actually never was. Now we face challenges. I mean, gerrymandering and sort of the ways in which minority rule is now built in different ways into our political system is a real challenge. For even if you get people out to vote, like, will that matter? So I think that actually looking at issues of reproductive justice and also the ways in which democracy is being undermined in a broad way, those movements have to work together, because there's no amount of outrage around reproductive justice that will do anything unless there's some young person out there who has like a brilliant vision that we can get around this without legislators. But it seems like if we're gonna change laws, we're going to have to deal with the ways that democracy is crumbling in many ways, that votes are mattering less and less, especially for liberals, right? And yet the last 50 years show me that there is a massive revolution that's possible. I mean, a lot of people were facing much worse circumstances and were able to make not complete change, but very, very serious change. The hope I take from this moment is, man, to look at the ancestors we've got and the people who've been working on the ground for the last 50 years, because people have lived in terrible circumstances in the United States over the course of time, and have been able to build worlds that were not completely equitable, but much more so than ever existed before. And we have to look to them and not necessarily replicate what they did, but take hope from their success. They were able to really make the world better. Trust the people who've been working on the ground, and also go to the people who've been working on the ground and figure out what we can do in this new world.
All right. Yeah, good.
So I know this really isn't a Texas issue because Texas doesn't have reservations or anything here, but my people are from Oklahoma. I'm a citizen of Cherokee Nation, and I've been hearing this argument by both, from mostly like pro-abortion people of like, why don't they just build abortion clinics on reservations? So can you speak about like tribal sovereignty and like the harm that will do for the people that would live on reservations?
Correction, we have 3 reservations in Texas, and I've already started conversations with Choctaw people here in Dallas about this very issue, and they're starting to think there might be some loopholes, but it's a long way to
Well, maybe you
get
can
through
speak
it.
on this better. I mean, the problem is that there is a vexed history of medical care in regards to Indigenous people. I mean, when Native women are being sterilized, it's the Indian Health Service who's doing it. It's like the federal government who they have that access by way of treaty, right? That is a part of the treaty obligations of the U.S. government to Native people. There were moments in the past where this idea was floated, and I don't know if this is a full answer, but Native people are, to put the pressure on them to provide abortions is really unreasonable, even if I understand that their sort of sovereign status offers this potential legal loophole, but it is unreasonable for us to ask. Oklahoma is they have 39 tribes who have been removed, and the treaties have been over and over again dashed, and they're currently at war with the governor, over issues of sovereignty. And so I don't know if I can speak precisely about it. I'm sure maybe some nations will be interested.
So my experience of this, because it's happening, is that relationship matters. And that's why I've started this conversation with people I've known for 20 years here in the Native community. They're talking to tribal leaders, other leaders, and we all think it's about a 15% chance that it'll go anywhere. They also say that, just like all of us, there's just give me my check from the gambling, people, all the way to like down with the US government, let's build clinics tomorrow, and everything in between, and it's going to be a tough run. And there are some laws, you can't commit a murder on a reservation and have sovereignty. So this goes to questions of whether they're going to pass personhood laws. There's a lot of complicated stuff. I agree with you, it's unfair to ask for this, but through relationship, and I'm not saying it's all there, but I'm saying we're starting to work on it, and if it works, it'll be a miracle.
And back in the 70s, there were a lot of, Native Red Power groups who talked very openly about how it was a problem for Native women not to be able to have access to a whole host of reproductive health care, right? That even though they had this deep history of sterilization, they were not the ones saying, like, abortion is a part of that problem. They were saying, we want to put more and more power in the hands of women to control their livelihoods, right? And that this was a part of doing that. But I don't.
It's a tough thing.
And also in Oklahoma, there's a lot of conservative, especially among certain members of the 5 tribes. There's a lot of evangelical conservative people too. So, there's not necessarily the will in all places.
Exactly right. Other question? We have about one chance for one more. Yeah. Come all the way. Squeaking all the way. I should have worn my leather shoes too, but it's okay.
Thanks so much for being here. When I've had conversations with anti-abortion people, there seems to be a sort of historical black hole that they live in which they never take into consideration the arguments that existed for legalizing abortion. Like whenever I speak with people who are anti-abortion, they never know why anybody advocated for legalizing it in the first place.
Yeah.
What is the history of how that memory holisation and disappearance of the argument for abortion came about, and what can be done to sort of erase it, if anything?
Yeah.
Good question. Yeah.
So this erasure of, I think that...
This is the first time he's ever been here. Yeah, Carla. Yeah.
So I think that, I think that in some ways the movement's been so good about erasing the past, this like whitewashed past where before legal abortion, there wasn't any abortion. Like they don't actually address like illegal abortion. They really want it to, I'm sure they know that it occurred, but it just cannot be something they reckon with. And the story of like, all the stories of the late 60s, when the clergy consultation service, this group of, ministers and rabbis are like helping women access legal abortion, that this is this open group of religious people using their moral authority, right? And not just secretly getting people to clinics, but testifying about it in legislatures, and making arguments, right? That this is a social good, that it's an individual good, that's a moral good, and all that gets erased. And I think that's the power of the movement to speak in the insular communities, right? That they're increasingly over the last 50 years have spoken in insular communities and heard the same thing over and over and over again, and that they were told that you can't trust any counter argument. That, we talk more and more about misinformation now, but when I look back at the anti-abortion movement from the early on, they're telling you, you can't trust the media, you can't trust doctors, you can't trust universities, right? All of them are spreading this misinformation. They're pulling the wool over your eyes. And so you can imagine how that would keep people, right, from taking any counter arguments they do encounter seriously, or really reckoning with them in any kind of way. That if anyone's encountered protesters, they want to argue on their terms. They don't want to argue on your terms. And unless you're prepared to really try to wrench the conversation elsewhere, they're going to talk to you on their talking points where they lead you to the conclusions they need you to go. And that's really, I think, a good synopsis of what the movement does. And yet it's everywhere, right? It's not just in certain communities, it's not just a protester. It's like, it's in your Sunday school. It's if you go to your church rock concert. Like it's if you're a mom who wants to know about parenting, but you get something from Focus on the Family, it's in everything, right? If you're in a particular audience, you don't have to be looking for it. I mean, I tell people now, it's like, especially when I talk to reporters from other parts of the country, that like as Americans, it's impossible to fully avoid anti-abortion arguments and images. Like it's almost impossible to be in the United States in your life and not encounter them, because they are putting them everywhere, but especially in communities, they put them there all the time and they weave it into your everyday life.
I went to the Women's March a few weeks ago, whenever it was, and I parked on the backside of the city hall, and as I was coming back to my car, I look up and there's a big, giant billboard that's all about anti-abortion stuff. It is. Yeah, they've done a good job in permeating this. I am on the steering team of the new clergy consulting service, so we are working on all kinds of ways in which that's going to be active again, including involving historians in this.
Yeah.
Where is your hope as a final close this up? Come on, Jen, give us some hope here. Boost us up a little bit so we don't all go home and really sad and crying.
Yeah.
Don't work too hard on that.
Yeah, I mean, I could say a lot more about all the other things that are like also at risk
Yeah.
when you don't have a right to privacy. But I guess I will say that, I guess I'll just reiterate that we have been able, some more so than others, to be at least a little complacent, right? With Roe has stood, and that has been easy for the movement then to punch away at, and we won't have that. So I guess the hope is, yes, some people have been able to be complacent, that is going to end, but that will, I hope, if we can keep our attention on it, if we can use our efforts on it, that it won't be immediate, right? We will not regain Roe or something like it or something better than it immediately, but that doesn't mean that things can't change again. It will take time, and I think there will be casualties of many kinds, but we can do it. People can do it. And I also, this is the other hopeful thing, I think that the anti-abortion movement has been able to say easy things. Everything's gonna be better if you have a legal abortion, right? Like, oh, no more racism, women are no longer gonna be traumatized, like, don't worry, deeply red states will create a whole host of social services for people who now have bigger families. Young person, you will feel like you've been a part of a social justice movement when this is achieved. And I think that is not the future that we're all gonna be looking at. And I think the movement's gonna have to reckon in a different way with these easy things they've been able to say for the last 50 years, easy promises about what a post-Roe world will look like. And I think if they have any interest at actually looking, there might be some cracks in that armor and in that movement, because it's not gonna line up with what they've envisioned. So, and I hope that will matter in taking next steps, right? Actually surveilling people, actually banning abortion across the United States, which of course is like the thing they need to try to do. They can't just like make it so you can go to New Mexico, you know? That's not what the movement wants. But will it be able to? Will the movement be able to be as strong as it has been when we are faced with the outcome? I don't know.
Jenn Holland, thanks for being on the front porch. Tiny U, a Western history of anti-abortion movement, of the anti-abortion movement. Get Jenn's book. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Our next front porch is July 10th with Jim Schutz and Will Evans, the author of The Accommodation, talking about how Dallas never had a civil rights movement, and that book is the Dallas read for the fall. July 10th will be right here with Jim Schutz and Will Evans, the publisher, who's brought that book. Thanks to the Cooks for making that connection for me. And so glad to have you here. Can you stick around a little bit? I know people want to talk to you. One more time, thanks, Jenn. Thanks for coming.